The world likes to imagine oil as a commodity, but in moments like this, oil becomes a weapon. Right now, the United States is telling Venezuela, you can pump your oil again, but only if you cut ties with China and Russia. Completely. And only if you sell that oil with us. Republicans call it strength. Some even call it genius. But many Democrats are using a different word, boneheaded. Because this is no longer just about Venezuela. This is about whether American power is being used strategically or impulsively, whether great power competition is being managed or provoked, and whether forcing a sovereign nation to choose sides over its own resources stabilizes the world or pushes it closer to conflict. If you want to understand where this path could lead, for global politics, for energy, and for ordinary people, stay with me. And if this kind of clear, grounded analysis matters to you, take a moment to follow and share. Now, let's slow this down and clearly define what's actually being proposed. Strip away the rhetoric, and the proposal is stark. The Trump administration is offering Venezuela a deal with two conditions. First, sever economic ties with China and Russia, countries deeply embedded in Venezuela's energy sector. Second, sell oil only in partnership with the United States. On paper, this looks like leverage. In reality, it's a radical redefinition of sovereignty. This is not a sanctions policy. It's not a gradual decoupling strategy. It's an ultimatum delivered in the middle of an already fractured global order. Supporters frame it as reclaiming America's hemisphere. Critics see something else. A zero-sum gamble that treats oil as spoils, not a public good belonging to the Venezuelan people. And here's the core question you and I have to confront. Is this a calculated effort to reduce Chinese and Russian influence? Or is it an act that misunderstands how power actually works in a multipolar world? Because history shows us something uncomfortable. Great powers rarely get to dictate terms without consequences. To see why, we have to go back to how Venezuela ended up here in the first place. To understand this moment, you have to understand Venezuela's dependency. For years, Venezuela's oil industry didn't just decline, it collapsed. Mismanagement, corruption, and sanctions hollowed it out. As Western capital pulled back, others stepped in. China and Russia didn't arrive out of ideology. They arrived through debt, financing, and infrastructure deals, oil for loans, technology transfers, survival economics. This wasn't a geopolitical romance. It was a transaction born of isolation. Over time, oil became Venezuela's only bargaining chip, and Beijing and Moscow learned how to play that hand, patiently accepting risk, waiting out pressure, embedding themselves quietly into the system. Now the United States wants to reverse that history in one move, not by rebuilding institutions first, not by restoring legitimacy, but by demanding a clean break. Here's the problem. Economic relationships are not light switches. You don't just turn them off without blowback. When you force a country to unwind years of dependence overnight, you don't create alignment, you create crisis. And crisis has a way of accelerating conflict, which brings us to the first flashpoint where this policy stops being theoretical and starts becoming dangerous. The first crisis is not hypothetical. It's political and it's immediate. The moment Washington makes oil conditional on obedience, it changes the stakes for everyone involved. For Venezuela, compliance means economic shock, contracts broken, debt structures destabilized, retaliation risk baked in. For China and Russia, this isn't about Venezuela alone. It's about precedent. If the United States can force a country to abandon existing partnerships as the price of survival, then no investment is secure. No long-term deal is safe from geopolitical override. That's why Democratic lawmakers warn of retaliation. Not dramatic retaliation, quiet retaliation, delayed retaliation, the kind that shows up later in trade, in diplomacy, in other contested regions. This is where escalation begins. Not with tanks, with signals. A world where energy access depends on choosing sides becomes a world where every deal is strategic and every strategy invites response. If you care about avoiding conflict with China and Russia, this is the wrong pressure point to rush. And yet, beneath this crisis lies something deeper, a hidden logic driving the entire approach. To understand that, we have to expose the mechanism underneath the policy. What's really happening here isn't improvisation, it's ideology. At the core of this policy is a belief that power is zero-sum. If China gains influence, America must lose. If Russia is present, the United States must expel it. Oil becomes the lever, not as an economic good, but as a geopolitical choke point. This is a revival of an old doctrine dressed in modern language. Control the hemisphere, deny rivals access, force alignment through dependency. But here's the flaw in that mechanism. Influence today doesn't work through ownership alone. It works through networks, finance, supply chains, debt, technology, legitimacy. You can block a sale, you can pressure a government, but you cannot instantly erase embedded systems without destabilizing the whole structure. When you treat geopolitics like a transaction, you ignore feedback loops, retaliation, realignment, shadow markets. Pressure doesn't disappear, it migrates. And when power is applied without an exit ramp, it doesn't resolve tension. It compresses it until it snaps somewhere else. That compression leads us directly into the second crisis. Bigger, faster, and far more global. The second crisis unfolds beyond Caracas and far beyond oil. Once this policy is declared, it doesn't stay regional. It echoes. China doesn't need to respond in Venezuela. It can respond elsewhere. In trade corridors, in technology restrictions, in diplomatic deadlock, at moments when cooperation matters most. Russia, facing pressure on multiple fronts, reads this as confirmation, not deterrence. Another signal that confrontation is the language of the system. This is how localized pressure becomes systemic stress. Suddenly, energy markets price in uncertainty. Allies ask quiet questions about precedent. Developing countries notice the pattern and start hedging faster. The world becomes sharper, more brittle, less forgiving of miscalculation. And here's the irony. A strategy meant to project strength can end up shrinking flexibility, because every move now demands a countermove. Every negotiation becomes a test of dominance. This is the moment where policymakers lose control of tempo. Events start moving faster than intentions. And when that happens, the consequences don't land on governments first. They land on people. Which brings us to the human cost, where geopolitics stops being abstract and starts being personal. If you're watching this from a distance, this can feel abstract. Power, oil, China, Russia. But if you're living inside a country like Venezuela, it's not abstract at all. For you, pressure doesn't arrive as policy. It arrives as prices. Jobs lost, services cut, uncertainty that never turns off. When foreign powers treat your country like a chessboard, you don't get a vote in the strategy. You just absorb the shock. Oil is supposed to be a pathway to recovery. Schools, hospitals, stability. But when access to your own resources is conditioned on geopolitical loyalty, development becomes collateral damage. You're told this is about freedom, but it doesn't feel like freedom when choices are imposed from the outside. This is what lawmakers mean when they warn about legitimacy. You can't build a stable future for a people while stripping them of agency. If this resonates, if you believe geopolitics should serve people, not sacrifice them, share this. Because these stories only matter if they're heard. And what's happening to Venezuela doesn't stay in Venezuela. The ripple effects are already spreading outward. What happens in Venezuela is a signal to the world. Countries across Latin America, Africa, and Asia are watching closely. Not because they love China or Russia, but because they understand vulnerability. If access to your own resources can be made conditional, if partnerships can be erased by external pressure, then neutrality becomes dangerous. This accelerates a quiet shift already underway. Middle powers hedge harder. They diversify alliances. They fragment the system. Energy markets feel it first. Investment slows. Risk premiums rise. Supply chains grow more politicized, less efficient. And geopolitically, the message is unmistakable. The Western Hemisphere is no longer just a region. It's a front line. That pushes China and Russia to respond asymmetrically, not head-on but sideways, in institutions, in standards, in influence campaigns that don't look like conflict until it's too late. This is how the global order erodes, not with collapse, but with accumulation, one pressure point at a time, which leaves us with the hardest question of all. Where does this trajectory actually lead? To answer that, we need to look forward and imagine three possible futures. There are three paths ahead. None of them are clean. All of them tell us something about how power works now. The first is the optimistic scenario. The pressure works partially. Venezuela negotiates limited adjustments. China and Russia recalibrate rather than retaliate. The United States pairs leverage with legitimacy building, allowing oil revenue to stabilize the country. Tension rises but is managed. The second is the most likely scenario. Fragmentation. Venezuela hedges quietly. China and Russia respond indirectly. Markets absorb uncertainty. No explosion, just a colder, harder system where trust erodes and alignment becomes transactional. Then there's the worst case. Retaliation compounds. Energy shocks spread. Diplomatic channels narrow. Every regional dispute becomes a proxy. A zero-sum world stops pretending otherwise. Here's the truth beneath all three. Power today isn't about forcing choices. It's about shaping environments. When leaders mistake leverage for strategy, they win headlines but lose stability. And systems always punish that confusion. Which brings us to the final question. What should we take from this moment? And what comes next? This moment isn't really about Venezuela. It's about how America chooses to use power in a crowded world. Strength isn't the ability to force compliance. It's the ability to design outcomes that don't require it. When oil becomes a demand instead of a development tool, legitimacy erodes. When geopolitics becomes a zero-sum game, conflict stops being an accident, it becomes a feature. The warning signs are already here. From lawmakers who understand escalation, from allies who worry about precedent, from people who live inside the consequences of these decisions. The future won't be decided by one deal, but by whether leaders learn to distinguish pressure from strategy. If you want more analysis like this clear, grounded, and human, follow this channel. Share it with someone who cares about where the world is headed. Because the next chapter of global politics won't be written in slogans. It will be written in choices. And the choices we make now echo longer than we think.